Right, let's dive in. Today we're going to be talking about something that, at first glance it might seem a little bit, I don't know, contradictory, even to a philosopher like you. We're talking about impossible worlds.
Yeah, impossible worlds. It's one of those things that once you start thinking about it, it can really kind of grab you. And we're going to be using for this deep dive, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on impossible worlds. Really kind of a foundational text if you want to get into this area.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, some philosophers, their first reaction to this might be to just dismiss it. Like how can we even talk about something that's impossible? It's
Mhm.
like it's meaningless, right?
Yeah.
Human schlick, they'd probably say, like, you can't even conceive of it, so what are we even talking about here?
Right, right. Yeah, the limits of conceivability, the limits of meaning.
But then you have someone like Hegel, who's always kind of shaking things up, who says, well, even contradictions can be thought. You know, even the contradictory can be imagined. And so it's like there's this tension there, right? This tension between what seems logically prohibited and what we seem to be able to at least entertain in our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that tension is really at the heart of the philosophical interest in impossible worlds.
Exactly. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this deep dive. We're going to be really rigorously exploring this concept of impossible world using this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry as our guide. We're going to be looking at, what are they, why have philosophers introduced them into their thinking, and some of the big debates that surround them, all the juicy stuff.
Yeah, all the good stuff. All the stuff that keeps us philosophers up at night.
That's right. And just to be totally clear, when we talk about impossible, we're not talking about something that's just, really unlikely or practically difficult. It's not like, oh, it's impossible for me to get to London and Tokyo in the next 24 hours.
Right. Yeah, that's a different kind of impossibility.
Right. We're talking about absolute impossibility, unrestricted. The kind of impossibility where it's just not even conceivable in a way.
Yeah. It's outside the realm of possibility altogether.
Yeah.
You think about all the possible worlds, right? All the different ways that reality could have been. Well, impossible worlds are outside of that. They're not part of that set.
Okay, so let's start by getting a little bit more specific about what these impossible worlds are. How do we define them? Because even though they seem like this kind of paradoxical, entity, philosophers have come up with some pretty precise ways of thinking about them. And the source that we're using here, it presents four main ways that impossible worlds have been defined in the literature.
Yeah, and the first one I think is probably the most intuitive. It's the idea of impossible ways. So just like possible worlds are often thought of as ways things could have been, impossible worlds are ways things could not have been. So the idea here is that there are some things that just they can't be. They're not possible.
Yeah, it's like there are limits to what's possible, right? It's not just this completely unbounded, realm of possibility. There are some things that are just off limits. And this is an idea that's been put forward by a number of philosophers, people like Salmon Yagisawa, Restall, Beale, and Van Frossen.
Yeah, those are some big names in the field.
Exactly. And then the second definition that we get in the source is what they call logic violators. So the idea here is that impossible worlds are worlds where the laws of logic, they just break down.
Yeah.
So maybe logical theorems are false in those worlds, or maybe logical truths don't hold, or maybe valid inferences lead to untrue conclusions. And of course, as soon as you start talking about the laws of logic, you have to start thinking about, well, which logic are we talking about?
Right.
Because there are all sorts of different logics out there.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. The kind of logic violation that you get in an impossible world is going to depend on the logic that you're using as your background. Right.
Right. Exactly. And so, one of the things that the philosophers have been particularly interested in is the idea of worlds where classical logic, the logic that we use most of the time, the logic that you and I are probably using right now, where that logic breaks down.
Yeah.
And those are what the source calls classical logic violators.
Right. So for example, you might have a world where the law of excluded middle doesn't hold. So, the law of excluded middle says that for any proposition, either that proposition is true or its negation is true. But in some impossible worlds, maybe that doesn't hold.
Yeah, that's a good example. And then the final definition that we get is what they call contradiction realizers. And I think this is the one that maybe people think of most often when they think about impossible worlds. These are worlds where a proposition and its negation are both true.
Yeah, the classic contradiction. So, A and not A, both true at the same time.
Right. And so you can see how these definitions kind of build on each other. Right. You know, contradiction realizers are a specific kind of classical logic violator.
Hmm.
And classical logic violators are a kind of logic violator. And all of these fall into the more general category of impossible ways.
Right. So you've got this kind of hierarchy of impossible worlds.
Yeah. And the source even mentions kind of towards the end this even newer idea, which I found really interesting, which is this idea that maybe logical impossibility itself is relative. So, maybe what counts as a law of logic in one world is different from what counts as a law of logic in another world. And so, a world might be impossible relative to one logic, but possible relative to another.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating idea. It kind of makes you wonder about, the very nature of logic itself. Is it something that's absolute?
Yeah.
Or is it something that's relative to particular worlds?
Right. It's really pushing the boundaries. So okay, so we've got some sense now of what these impossible worlds are, but then of course the big question is, why?
Hmm.
Why have philosophers, who are supposed to be all about, reason and consistency, why have they even bothered to think about these things? What's the point?
Well, one of the main reasons is that it can help us to understand possibility itself. So much of philosophy is concerned with what's possible, with what could be the case. And it turns out that thinking about what's impossible can actually shed a lot of light on what's possible.
So it's like by looking at the negative space, you can actually better understand the positive space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the arguments that philosophers have given for taking impossible worlds seriously is what's sometimes called the argument from ways. And this argument basically says that if we're willing to talk about possible worlds, which, a lot of philosophers are, then we should also be willing to talk about impossible worlds.
Yeah, it's like you can't have one without the other.
Right. So the argument goes something like this. We often talk about ways things could have been. We say things like, "Oh, if I had left the house 5 minutes earlier, I wouldn't have missed the bus," or "If I had studied harder, I would have gotten a better grade." And those ways things could have been, those are often thought of as possible
Yeah,
worlds.
like each one of those is a different possible world.
Right. But we also talk about ways things could not have been. We say things like, "Oh, it's impossible for me to be in two places at once," or "It's impossible for a square circle to exist."
Yeah, that's true. I do say that sometimes.
Right. And so the argument from Ways says that if we're going to talk about ways things could have been seriously and say that those ways correspond to possible worlds, then we should also talk about ways things could not have been seriously and say that those ways correspond to impossible worlds.
Okay, so there's a certain symmetry there,
Yeah.
between possibility and impossibility.
Yeah. And this argument has been defended by a number of philosophers, including Beale and Van Friesen. They have this great line where they say Ways talk goes both ways.
Yeah, that's a good one. But of course not everyone buys this argument.
Yeah.
Some philosophers think that it's a little bit too quick. They say, well, okay, maybe we do talk about ways things could not have been. But that doesn't mean that we have to take those ways as seriously as we take ways things could have been.
Right. And some philosophers have even used this argument from Ways to argue against possible worlds. They say, look, if taking Ways talk seriously means that we have to believe in impossible worlds, then maybe we shouldn't take Ways talk seriously at all.
Yeah, it's like a modus tollens against possible worlds.
Right. So, the argument from Ways, it's a controversial argument, but it's definitely one of the main motivations for taking impossible worlds seriously.
Yeah, it's a good one to keep in mind. And then another really important motivation, and this one I think is particularly interesting for philosophers who are interested in logic, is the fact that we seem to be able to do something called counterpossible reasoning.
Yeah, counterpossible reasoning. This is the idea that we can reason from impossible premises. So we can say things like, okay, suppose that 2 + 2 = 5. What would follow from that?
Yeah, and we can actually have a conversation about that. We can explore the consequences of that supposition.
Right. And we don't just immediately say, well, that's impossible, so anything follows.
Right.
We don't just go into this kind of explosion of consequences.
Right, because we can still distinguish between different impossible scenarios. It's not like every impossible scenario is just the same.
Exactly. And so the fact that we can do this, the fact that we can engage in this kind of counterpossible reasoning, it suggests that we're not just reasoning about possible worlds. We're also reasoning about impossible worlds.
Yeah, it's like we have this capacity to think about things that couldn't possibly be the case, and to do it in a way that's not just completely arbitrary.
Right. And this is one of the things that really motivates a lot of the work on impossible worlds, because it seems like if we want to understand counterpossible reasoning, then we need a way to represent impossible worlds.
Yeah, it's like they're necessary to make sense of how we think.
Exactly. And this connects really nicely with another area where impossible worlds have been really useful, which is in the analysis of counterpossible conditionals.
Right. So a counterpossible conditional is a conditional statement where the antecedent, the if part of the conditional, is impossible.
Right. So, an example might be something like, if Hobbes had squared the circle, then mathematicians would have been amazed.
Yeah, that's a good one. And the problem is that if you try to analyze these counterpossible conditionals using standard possible world semantics, you run into some real difficulties.
Right. Because according to possible world semantics, a conditional statement is true if the consequent is true in all of the possible worlds where the antecedent is true.
Yeah, so it's like you're looking at all the possible worlds where the antecedent is true, and you're seeing if the consequent is true in all of those worlds.
Right. But if the antecedent is impossible, then there are no possible worlds where the antecedent is true.
Right, because it's impossible.
Exactly. And so according to possible world semantics, the conditional would be vacuously true. It would be true because there are no worlds where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false.
So it's true by default.
Right. But that doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem right to say that the conditional, if Hobbes had squared the circle, then mathematicians would have been amazed, is true just because Hobbes couldn't have squared the circle.
Yeah, it seems like there's something more going on there. It's not just, vacuously true.
Right. And so one way to deal with this problem is to introduce impossible worlds. If we allow for impossible worlds, then we can have worlds where Hobbes does square the circle. And then we can look at those worlds and see whether mathematicians are amazed in those worlds.
Right. So it's like impossible worlds give us a way to actually evaluate these counterpossible conditionals in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. And there are a number of philosophers who have developed semantics for counterfactuals that use impossible worlds.
Yeah. And this is an area where the philosophical literature on impossible worlds is really, really rich.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting work being done in this area.
Okay, so we've seen now how impossible worlds can be used to understand possibility itself. And we've seen how they can be used to understand counterpossible reasoning and counterpossible conditionals. But these are just a couple of the many applications of impossible worlds in philosophy.
Yeah.
The source that we're using, it goes on to discuss a whole bunch of other applications.
Right. And these applications really span a lot of different areas of philosophy. So impossible worlds have been used to understand intentional states, like beliefs and desires. They've been used to understand inconsistent information, like the kind of information that you might find in a database that's got some errors in it. They've been used to understand fiction.
Yeah, and even things like propositional content,
Yeah.
the meaning of sentences.
Right. So they really are a very versatile tool.
And one of the things that I found really fascinating is the idea that impossible worlds can actually help us to understand things that seem like they're very much about the actual world.
Mm.
So for example, one of the things that philosophers have used impossible worlds to understand is the nature of knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. So, one of the problems that philosophers of knowledge have struggled with is the problem of logical omniscience. And this is the problem that if you know something, then you know all of the logical consequences of that thing.
So, if you know that Socrates is a man and you know that all men are mortal, then you must also know that Socrates is mortal.
Right, but this seems like too strong a requirement for knowledge. It seems like it's possible for someone to know something without knowing all of the logical consequences of that thing.
Yeah, and one way to try to deal with this problem is to introduce impossible worlds into your epistemology.
Yeah.
So you might say that someone knows something if that thing is true in all of the possible worlds that are compatible with their beliefs. But you might also say that there are some impossible worlds that are compatible with their beliefs. And in those impossible worlds, the logical consequences of what they know might not be true.
Right. So, maybe there's an impossible world where Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, but Socrates is not mortal.
Right. And so you can use impossible worlds to kind of create this space where someone's beliefs can be locally consistent, without being globally consistent.
Exactly. Yeah. So, maybe someone believes that Socrates is a man and that all men are mortal, but they also believe that Socrates is not mortal, and you can represent those beliefs using a set of worlds, some of which are possible and some of which are impossible.
Right. And so impossible worlds can actually help us to understand how people can have inconsistent beliefs without being completely irrational.
Yeah. And this is just one example of how impossible worlds have been used to understand epistemic phenomena.
So we've seen how impossible worlds can be used to understand possibility itself. We've seen how they can be used to understand counterpossible reasoning and counterpossible conditionals. We've seen how they can be used to understand intentional states, inconsistent information, fiction, propositional content, knowledge.
And I think it's really important to emphasize that this is just a small sample of the applications of impossible worlds. Philosophers are really just starting to explore the potential of this concept.
Yeah, it's a really exciting area, and I think one of the things that makes it so exciting is that it's so fundamental.
Yeah.
It's about the very nature of possibility and impossibility, and it's about the limits of logic and reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also really exciting because it's a really interdisciplinary area. It brings together philosophers who are working in logic, in metaphysics, in epistemology, in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so rich. You have all these different perspectives coming together, and they're all kind of feeding off of each other.
Yeah, it's a really vibrant area of research.
Okay, so we've talked about what impossible worlds are. We've talked about why philosophers are interested in them, but but of course, as with any philosophical idea, there are objections. There are people that say, "Well, hold on a second. This whole idea of impossible worlds, it's just too strange. It's just too paradoxical."
Yeah, and some of those objections are really, really serious.
Yeah. So let's take a look at some of the main objections to impossible worlds,
Mhm.
and see how proponents of impossible worlds have responded to those objections.
Okay. So one of the most common objections to impossible worlds is that they lead to contradictions, So the objection goes something like this. If there are impossible worlds, then there are worlds where contradictions are true. But if contradictions are true, then anything follows. And so if there are impossible worlds, then anything
And
follows.
that would be a bad thing, right? Because it would mean that logic would just completely break down.
Right. So this is a serious objection, and it's an objection that proponents of impossible worlds need to take seriously.
Yeah. So how do they respond to it?
Well, there are a couple of different ways to respond to it. One way is to say that impossible worlds don't actually lead to contradictions. So you might say that the contradictions that are true in impossible worlds are just local contradictions. They're contradictions that are true at a particular world, but they don't infect the rest of logic.
So it's like they're contained within those worlds.
Yeah, and so you might say that the fact that there's a contradiction true in some impossible world doesn't mean that anything follows in the actual world.
Okay, so that's one way to respond to this objection.
Yeah. And then another way to respond to it is to say that even if impossible worlds do lead to contradictions, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
So you're saying we should just embrace the contradictions.
Well, not exactly, but you might say that the contradictions that arise from impossible worlds are just a reflection of the fact that the world is a very complex place, and that our logical systems are not always able to fully capture that complexity.
So it's like the contradictions are a sign that we need to develop more sophisticated logical systems.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Okay, so those are a couple of ways to respond to the objection that impossible worlds lead to contradictions.
Right. And there are other objections to impossible worlds as well. So another objection is that impossible worlds are just too strange. They're just not the kind of things that we should be taking seriously.
Yeah, it's like they're just too weird.
Right. And I think this is a fair objection. Impossible worlds are strange, but I think that they're strange in a good way. They're strange in a way that can actually help us to understand the world better.
So it's like they're a useful kind of strangeness.
Right. And I think that if we're willing to embrace that strangeness, then we can learn a lot from impossible worlds.
Okay, so those are just a couple of the main objections to impossible world. And as we've seen, there are ways to respond to those objections.
Right. And I think that the debate over impossible worlds is a really important debate,
Hmm.
because it's a debate about the limits of possibility and the nature of logic and reason.
Yeah, it's a debate that gets to the very heart of what it means to be a philosopher.
Exactly. And I think that it's a debate that everyone who's interested in philosophy should be aware of.
Well, thank you for taking us on this deep dive into the world of impossible worlds.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's really made me think about the nature of possibility and impossibility in a whole new way.
Yeah, me too.
And I think it's really raised some really interesting questions that I'm gonna continue to think about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more to explore here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about impossible worlds, I would definitely recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry that we used for this deep dive. It's a great starting point, and there's also a lot of other great work out there on this topic.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to really dive in and wrestle with these ideas. They're challenging, but they're also really, really rewarding.
Absolutely. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep thinking
Keep thinking
about the impossible.
about the impossible.